In the quiet London suburb of Enfield, an ordinary house underwent terrifying transformations in the autumn of 1977. Mysterious noises, furniture moving on its own, and objects floating in the air turned the lives of the Hodgson family into a living nightmare. What began as unexplained phenomena turned into a terrifying encounter with inexplicable forces. The Enfield story became one of the most famous and terrifying tales of possession in the history of psychic research. Are you ready to discover the truth behind this horror? The Enfield case is one of the most famous possession and haunting cases that sparked widespread controversy. It is one of the rare cases that was documented with both audio and video, and its protagonists are still alive. The story began in a small rented house in the Enfield suburb of London, where a divorced woman named Peggy Hodgson lived with her 4 children: Margaret, 12 years old, Janet, 11 years old, Johnny, 10 years old, and Billy, 7 years old. One night in 1977, the mother sent her children to bed early and sat alone in the living room watching television. After a while, she heard noises coming from her daughter's room on the 2nd floor. She shouted at them to stop playing and go to sleep, but the noise continued. Mrs. Hodgson, now angry, got up and went to her daughter's room to scold them. However, when she opened the door, she found the 2 girls sitting silently in their beds, staring in terror at the heavy wooden wardrobe, which had moved from its place against the wall and was now in the middle of the room. The mother was astonished by this and slowly pushed the wardrobe back to its original place. She stepped back, and the wardrobe moved again on its own to the center of the room. The experience was terrifying, and the mother felt a strange presence in the room, as if someone else was there, someone invisible. Then she heard 3 consecutive knocks on the wall, followed by a short silence. And then the knocking resumed, this time on another wall. Terrified by what was happening, the mother gathered her 4 children and went to her neighbor's house for help. The neighbor sent her husband, Vic, a large, strong man who worked in construction, to investigate. Vic entered the house and began to examine it. Initially, he didn't notice anything unusual. Then he heard knocking on the wall and went upstairs to find the source of the sound. To his astonishment, the knocking followed him upstairs, almost as if it were his shadow, moving with him wherever he went in the house. Despite his fear, Vic mustered his courage and went down to the basement, thinking that the source of the knocking might be a malfunction in the water pipes. But the pipes were intact, and yet the knocking persisted. Frightened, he fled back to his own house. Mrs. Hodgson later described her neighbor's appearance at that moment, saying, "I had never seen such a large man so terrified in my life." Finally, Mrs. Hodgson called the police. A police officer and a policewoman arrived and searched the house thoroughly, trying to find the source of the knocking on the walls, but they found nothing. Then suddenly, one of Mrs. Hodgson's children screamed, pointing towards a chair in the living room. Policewoman Caroline Heaps described what she saw at that moment as follows. "There was a chair next to the sofa. I looked at it and noticed that it was shaking violently. Then it started to move on its own until it came to rest against the kitchen wall. It moved a distance of 3 to 4 feet before stopping. The officers inspected the chair thoroughly, looking for a string or some sort of trick. but they found nothing. Overcome with fear, they quickly left after informing Mrs. Hodgson that what was happening in her home was not within the police's jurisdiction. In the following days, the pace of mysterious events in Mrs. Hodgson's house increased, and the news quickly spread throughout the neighborhood, eventually reaching the ears of the press. 2 reporters from the Daily Mirror came to investigate the case. One of them described the visit, saying there was utter chaos. Things were flying in the air on their own, and people were screaming in terror. After the report was published in the Daily Mirror, reporters flocked to the family's house, even prompting the BBC to send a team that recorded the mysterious knocking sounds on the walls. However, when they returned to their headquarters, they found that the metal parts of their equipment had mysteriously twisted, and all the recordings had been erased. A few weeks later, Mrs. Hodgson contacted the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, in the hope that they could help her. The society sent 2 of its investigators, Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, who later co-authored a book about their experience in Enfield. From the very first day with the family, the investigators witnessed extremely strange occurrences. Maurice reported seeing Lego bricks floating in the air, and when he caught one, it was hot. He also saw furniture moving on its own, a shirt on a table rising and floating in the air, and quickly noticed that most of the strange events were centered around Mrs. Hodgson's daughters, especially the younger one, Janet. Everything seemed to go crazy in her presence. Furniture moved on its own, objects floated in the air, iron bars twisted, water cups filled themselves, books appeared and disappeared. The television turned on by itself, and the heavy stone fireplace detached from the wall and rolled to the center of the room. Everything revolved around Janet, and some of her family members and neighbors swore they saw her levitating in her room. She began entering a trance-like state, similar to epilepsy, during which she became extremely strong enough to once push a journalist, throwing him 4 meters through the air. She also started speaking in a gruff voice that came from her mouth without moving her lips.
These teenage sisters believe they're haunted by a poltergeist.
I was going to ask the same question as I asked earlier. How many voices are there?
600.
600 voices.
I know the joke.
How many really are there, Margaret?
I think so far we've had 10
3.
sensible voices, but the rest of the names are absolute rubbish.
With the emergence of this voice, the investigators realized they were dealing with a case of demonic possession. They began conversing with the voice, or rather with the entity that had possessed Janet's body, recording these conversations on tapes. Through these discussions, they learned that the voice belonged to an old man named Bill Wilkins, who had lived in the house many years ago and had died alone from a stroke. In one of his conversations, he described how he died, saying, "Before I died, I went blind and had a hemorrhage in my head. I felt sleepy. Then I died on the chair next to the stairs on the ground floor."
Me, whether you remember what happened to you when you died.
I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
Why can't Janet feel you?
I'm invisible.
You're invisible. Why are you invisible?
So much H-O-S.
The strange thing was that Janet couldn't remember anything the spirit said through her after coming out of her trance or possession state, as if she had been drugged or asleep. To ensure that the girl wasn't faking the change in her voice, the investigators had her drink a little water and hold it in her mouth while the voice spoke through her. They also consulted a throat specialist who told them that the possibility of the girl faking such a deep voice without moving her lips seemed impossible, as it would certainly destroy her vocal cords within minutes. The most bizarre part of the story is that several months later, someone contacted Maurice, investigator, and informed him that he was the son of Mr. Bill Wilkins and that his father had indeed died in Mrs. Hodgson's house many years ago. During that period, the investigators also set up sensitive cameras in Janet's room. These cameras operated automatically, capturing images at a rate of 1 frame every quarter of a second whenever any unusual movement occurred inside the room. With these cameras, the investigators managed to capture a series of photographs that puzzled and terrified many people in England at the time. Over time, these images became iconic representations of all cases of possession and demonic activity. Some of these photos showed furniture and items moving on their own in Janet's room, while others depicted Janet levitating in the air within her room with an expression of terror and panic on her face, as if some invisible force was carrying her and spinning her around the room. A powerful force that Janet once described in an interview with Channel 4 as follows: "I was being controlled by an unseen force that no one could understand. I don't like thinking about it much." The strange events in the Hodgson family home continued for about 14 months before gradually subsiding, starting in the fall of 1978. After that period, Janet got married and moved out of the house. The house is now occupied by another family who refuses to speak to journalists. The Enfield case remains open to both supporters and skeptics. But as investigator Maurice Gross pointed out, even if we assume that the girls fabricated some aspects, the strange incidents that occurred in this house cannot be easily explained, such as the heavy fireplace moving from the wall and the knocking on the walls that sometimes happened when all family members were in the same room. Janet, who is now in her 40s, has confirmed in interviews that the events she experienced were real and that she was afraid to return to the house. She believes that what happened began after she played with a Ouija board, which opened the door to an unseen entity. Janet was admitted to a mental institution in 1978 and was released with her mental and psychological health intact. But she insists that what happened was real and that the spirit that possessed her truly existed.